Sweet. Everybody ready?
Yeah.
Are we recording?
Recording.
Sweet. So welcome to the Strength Athlete Podcast, episode 2. Today we do have all of the coaching staff here with us, and we have an interesting conversation lined up ahead of us. Subject really being periodization and long-term planning, and several different aspects that apply to that. So we've got Bryce, as well as Chris, Eric, and our newest coach, Joe Stanek. And if you guys want to say hi, we'll get rolling.
Hey, what's going on?
What's up?
Yo.
So basically, we're just going to have Bryce introduce the topic today. This was his brainchild a little bit, so I'll just pass the mic off to him.
Yeah, man. So essentially, by the way, this is podcast number 2. Super excited about doing this. And as we continue to get on these, I'd like them to be some substance to talk about different training topics and stuff to cover some of the conversations that us coaches always have and just in an effort to bring up some good conversational topics and get out some good information. So this time specifically, I'd like to spend some time talking about how powerlifting differs from other sports in terms of the model of what it's like to train for competition in our sport versus other sports, what long-term planning is like. How should someone be training as a 16-year-old versus a 25-year-old versus a 40-year-old, and so on? Are there differences in how those people should train for powerlifting versus some other sport? What are the parameters there? And then, kind of zooming in just a little bit, if you've got multiple meets throughout the year, this is something Hani was interested in talking about. What should we do as far as planning for competition? Should we be worried about putting up our best performance progressively in meets number 1 through 3? Is there a specific one that you need to do extra well for? And how do you go about making that happen? I kind of want to launch into it. Chris comes from a background working in multiple sports, in collegiate sports. Chris, I think you mentioned it was basketball and what else?
Wrestling.
Basketball and wrestling. So both of those have like a competitive season, a preseason, an offseason. Can you tell me a little about how that works or how that worked when you were working with them?
So pretty much managing training is kind of different. So when you compare it to powerlifting, actually, let me back up a little bit. So with sports, training is going to look completely different as it is preseason than it is going to look. So basically 4 more important phases of training: preseason, in-season, post, and recovery. So preseason kind of mean off-season as well, or kind of long-term. So training is going to look completely different long-term when so there's going to be a lot less emphasis on strength and pushing the intensity while the athletes are in season, just because their priority is how they're competing in their specific sport, less more so than how their actual training is going in the weight room. Off season, that's where we kind of go crazy and we push as much volume as we can, push as much intensity as we can. That's where we're going for PRs and having we just go to town in the gym. So I mean, it just comes down to where the athlete is in their year and what the priority is. So off season, we're focusing more on improving them in terms of getting them bigger, stronger, faster. Whereas while they are in their season, they're focusing on being an actual athlete rather than trying to improve.
So Chris, if I can jump in and ask a question regarding that. So dealing with collegiate athletes, you said basketball and wrestling. Number one, how would you say the training differed, the weight room training off season would differ between basketball and wrestling? And then from those athletic sides, compare that to how we would train for powerlifting. So are you pushing as hard and kind of pushing hard for those 1 rep maxes and for things like that? Or are you trying to find different ways of measuring progress so you can tell that you're doing better throughout the off season with a lower injury risk? So
with the collegiate athletes, we never ever tested 1 rep maxes because the 1 rep maxes didn't really ever matter for them. So it had no carryover for their specific sport. So with basketball, more so than Wrestling, we were focusing on the off season. We were strictly focusing on getting them stronger. So their off season was I'm getting stronger. Whereas with the basketball athletes, there's much more to basketball than just getting them stronger. Because when you think about when you're shooting a free throw or a shot. If I make someone a lot stronger upper body wise, that's going to change the mechanics of how they shoot. So we're not pushing the strength side so much. I mean, I want to get them stronger, but it's less about that, but more than just kind of getting them faster. So in their off season, it's more about mechanics and movement and getting them better and more efficient at those specific movements, while yes, still kind of improving their strength. But with wrestlers, that's a whole different kind of strength sport, and get their strength. Like, we're pushing things, the volume's pretty high for wrestling. So pretty different between the two. So with basketball, much more focused on movement and mechanics and improving them more so as I guess you can call it as an athlete in the off season. Whereas with wrestlers, we're focusing on the strength side of things, and just we're pushing squats and bench and Olympic movements. And they're like in the off season, you can pretty much call them bodybuilders more so than anything.
The one thing that, I kind of want to bridge off of that, Chris, is that in those other sports, in lots of aspects, you're not just focusing on strength. It's not a single dimension of improvement in the off season. You've got to focus on speed, possibly endurance to make it through a basketball game or a wrestling match, or different energy systems tailored to their sport. And that's one difference from powerlifting, is that we kind of get lucky in that cardiovascular capacity is pretty ancillary in powerlifting compared to just purely focusing on probably strength and hypertrophy as, head honchos number 1 and 2.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason why it's called strength and conditioning.
Yeah.
Most definitely.
So, as far as those sports goes, it seems like there's a yearly schedule that you have to adhere to, and every year that repeats itself. Unless it happens to also be an Olympic sport and they happen to be Olympic competitors, in which case there's an every 4 yearly kind of macro cycle. But that's one thing that I feel is different in powerlifting, is that our sport is cyclical over a much smaller period of time. It's 8 weeks, 12 weeks, or however long in between a training test. And that's our unit of periodization around. So while a wrestling athlete might go through these phases every year, we kind of crunch through a lot of that stuff in a smaller period of time. And I wanted to kick it over to one of you guys to just, chat about what that's like.
Yeah, I would say on average, I think most competitive powerlifters are competing maybe 3 to 4 times a year. So that's maybe a meet every 12 to 20 weeks, depending on how often they want to. And usually for the more advanced lifters, they're going to have one meet throughout the year that they want to prioritize and really push hard for. So in your case, Bryce, that meet for this year was probably the Nationals. I know Arnold was big for you as well, but the big focus for 2016 at least was to try to do as well as possible at Nationals. And that's the case for most of the elite level lifters in our sport right now. So they're having 1 or 2 meets where they really want to prioritize and have their best performance, and then maybe the local or regional type of meets where maybe they're not pushing quite as hard in terms of their overall training volume, or just pushing for PRs and things like that.
That might be the case for elite athletes, but do you think the case might also be the same for beginner athletes, or do you just expect progress meet to meet? And what does it mean to have a meet that you care the most about? Does that mean that your training volume is higher, or intensity is higher, or how does that manifest itself in training?
I think most of the time it's something where you're trying to push to a new level. So pushing training volume in most cases what's going to drive progress, at least to a certain extent, where you're not risking injury. But for the more novice or intermediate athletes, they can probably expect to make at least some sort of measurable progress from meet to meet. Eventually they'll get to a point where maybe that doesn't happen, and then that's where I guess you might be considered a more advanced lifter, when you have to prioritize that 1 or 2 meets each year where you really want to try to come out at your best.
The other thing I wanted to mention was I wanted to bridge this paradigm between what Chris was talking about when it came to how the year is structured in terms of these collegiate sports and how things are structured on our end. I mean, obviously there's a lot of differences, but are there any similarities in terms of like a recovery period, a volume period, a test, like a competitive period? And can you guys speak to how those things might mirror in powerlifting?
Go ahead, Joe.
I think that's definitely true in a sense. I mean, there are points in the year, depending on your federation, where there's going to be more meets. There's probably more of a likelihood that you're going to be competing. In terms of a recovery period, usually after that big meet of the year, which for many lifters in the USAPL, for example, is going to be Raw Nationals, which is probably that time right now is probably going to be that recovery period where you're not really going to be focusing on looking towards a meet just because you came off of your biggest meet of the year.
Eric, as far as programming for athletes, we kind of have these deloads or like a structured transition phase or something like that, and then some amount of time where the focus is on increased training volume and kind of pushing muscle adaptations in terms of increased muscle mass. Like, how do you structure that in the broad brushstrokes for a lot of athletes? Let's say they just came off a competition. How would you get them ready for the next one if it was like in 16 weeks?
Right. So I think when you're coming off maybe your biggest meet like nationals, which a lot of people are just finishing nationals here and in Australia and Great Britain, you're going to want to have a phase where it's a little bit less competition specificity, not pushing the intensity quite as much as you were, maybe trying some movements that you haven't done in a while, just to have some variety in there, both for the sake of mental sanity and just to give yourself a break from the competition lifts, because those can wear you down quite a bit.
I'm going to stop you for a sec, just in terms of clarification. When you said competition specificity, does that mean that you're doing different movements or you're doing different rep ranges than you would normally do in training?
I mean specificity is in terms of exercise selection.
Okay.
So not just doing, your competition low bar squat or bench press or deadlift, doing different stances, different grips, or different exercises altogether. I think that's probably the best time to include those. And then when you have another meet date nailed down, that's when you can start to maybe plan out the transition towards more specificity again.
Cool.
I think this is actually a healthy time to bring up a topic that I believe it was Greg Knuckles that wrote about, and this is something we were tracking for a little while, talking about training monotony and its relation to injury occurrence. And so something like a structured period, stepping away from the competition-specific lifts, to take a step backwards here, talking about how most of us, I would say, plan our athletes' training going into big competitions, something like Raw Nationals or something like the Arnold or IPF World Championships. The training tends to be very specific. It would be where, if you have 3 or 4 occurrences of your squat variations or your bench or your deadlift variations in the course of a week, where in the far off season, 30% of those might be competition specific. Getting closer to a competition, we're talking about 75 or 80% of them being competition specific in some cases. Obviously, it's not the same for everyone. But in doing so, if you spend all year round training that way, you tend to have a high level of what I believe is called training monotony. It's been a while since I read that article, and I think it was Knuckles, correct me if I'm wrong, but there tends to be a higher incidence of injury in people who don't take time away from just training their competition-specific movements. So if all you're doing is low bar squats, pause bench press, and whatever your competition variant deadlift stance is all year round, you tend to have a higher incidence of injury. And so in stepping away from that, we're minimizing that ability, which is kind of one of our biggest roles as coaches, if not the biggest role, because anybody can train hard, anybody can find a periodization model online, but a lot of what our responsibility is kind of pulling the reins back, so to speak. So ultimately keeping people from pushing themselves too hard, keeping people from deadlifting an all-time 805-pound PR a week after their biggest meet of the year. And if anybody could hear the air horn that we all have up on our screens right now, I'd be pressing that button. But ultimately, structuring that time in such a way that it helps to maximize not only recoverability, but essentially minimize the the chance of us getting someone hurt, because a lot of times getting hurt comes in the oddest of times. I was talking to Chris about this earlier. A lot of incidences where people are getting hurt, it'll happen in their third warm-up set where they're working up to a 405-pound squat where they're going to do a set of 10 and they're at 315 and they're doing a double and oops, tweaked something in my back. And so it can happen in the weirdest times. It's not always when you're going for a 1-rep max or when you're trying to hit a PR or anything like that. So any way we can try to mitigate that is going to be a positive thing, really.
Yeah, Hani. I think also to your point, another good thing about having that period is also to kind of prevent mental burnout. I think that's very important for a lot of athletes who are, competing throughout the year. We see them kind of start to get to a point where the fatigue sets in mentally, and so having that period of variety in training also prevents them from wanting to take a step back from the sport. It just kind of keeps it fresh in your head, and also just kind of like lets the stress of competition dissipate.
Hani, what you mentioned, there's just a ton of things to talk about in there. The one thing that I wanted to bring about, it's not that specificity is bad, and there's like this balance that we have to achieve in terms of specificity. So high amounts of specificity, like we've been training, and like most of our athletes train pretty much year round in some capacity. How do you balance that with this need to take breaks every once in a while? How often is every once in a while? Like, is it really individual, or like how do you kind of balance things so that the athlete really is able to make progress year round, but not hate powerlifting, as I like to say? Because the last thing we want is someone to be turned off from powerlifting just because, like, if you do anything enough, you start to hate it. You know what I mean? Like, if you listen to a song too much, you start to hate it. Like, you can't have sushi every day is what I'm trying to say. So how do you I don't know. I'm going on record. You can't have sushi every day.
I'm going to go ahead and we're going to have to get Alberto Nunez on our next podcast to have the sushi every day discussion.
Yeah.
It's actually a study that he's been conducting with Dr. Mike Zordos, maximal sushi intake daily.
You can't do it, man. It's burnout.
do you undulate the sushi intake? Or
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. You alternate the fish with fat content. You start with ahi, work your way to salmon. But anyway, back on topic here. So how do we structure that in the course of a year? And so this kind of comes back to what Eric was talking about and kind of segues into what I wanted to bring up a little bit later is how do we kind of plan out a year in such a way where we pick what's most important, and how do we as coaches kind of end up effectively managing expectation? And I think that's a kind of an underrated role that you don't really hear a lot about from people who are, let's say, novice coaches or people who are self-proclaimed coaches, maybe people who haven't been doing it for a while or haven't coached a lot of people. They wouldn't know that for someone like Chris Aydin, for example, he's been competing for years in different forms of strength and physique sport. He's been training. He's kind of at the upper level of high intermediate into low to mid advanced athlete. And so we can't expect Chris to PR his lifts 4 times a year. And so if Chris were my client and he was competing, let's say he qualified for the Arnold. And so he competed at Raw Nationals, the Arnold, some trivial meet in July, and some qualification meet or warm-up meet in September. Let's say 4 weeks out, he hits his openers as final attempts at a meet in September. And so we structure his year in such a way where I'm going to have to tell Chris, I'm going to have to let him know that, number 1, September, we're not going above your openers. And number 2, in July, we can't expect a big performance, but we're going to kick ass when it comes time for Raw Nationals. We're going to get you that qualification. And then we're going to push you really hard leading into the Arnold so you can set some PRs over what you did to get there. And so we structure the whole year in such a way to do that. So the times when we would spend maybe more time focusing on the non-competition lifts. So I was talking to you guys about this earlier, like having one of my guys work up to see how high we can get his front squat during the off season so he can kind of have a mental break from all the tempo squats that I've made him do, which he's probably done more on his own than the entire TSA team collectively since we started working together. But sorry for that, Darrington, but they've been effective for him, and it's, you can't argue with a 50-pound squat increase on a 500 Wilks lifter. But essentially, we would take those times, let's say after the Arnold, would be the beginning of the furthest from important competition period of the year. And in that initial time, number 1, I would try to step away from the competition movements almost entirely. And So I would have someone, if they were a low bar squatter, wide grip bencher, sumo deadlifter, I would have them probably still keep the barbell on their back in some fashion. So I would have them doing like a high bar squat, something with like a safety bar, maybe front squats. I would have them doing a narrower grip bench or some kind of variation with their wider grip, like a pin press or an incline bench, dumbbell bench press, things like that. Ultimately, taking them away from what they were doing before, putting them somewhere where they're not specifically trained and adapted, and allowing them to make measurable progress there. That helps to keep motivation levels up, because the fact of the matter is, after pushing for 32 weeks for the prep that you had leading into the Raw Nationals and then leading into the Arnold, odds on you're not going to make a whole bunch of progress during that first, during the remaining weeks that you have in the year. So you're going to have to take some time.
Crap. Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to feel like crap. And if you keep pushing the competition lifts, even 5 pounds, you'd be lucky to get an advanced athlete during that time period. So by shifting away from it, you kind of allow yourself to kind of detrain in a way on those competition lifts. You allow yourself to get more stimulus from less work by taking your focus and putting it elsewhere. So working towards that 400-pound front squat, or working towards that all-time PR on your close grip bench press, or improving, the most number of weight or the most amount of weight you've done for 5 reps on the conventional deadlift. It allows us to still be focused and to still be competitive. It allows us to keep that edge and kind of stay zoned in, while also, again, minimizing that risk for injury. And so communicating that to people has been kind of something I've been focusing more on lately, in that I had someone who just competed at British Nationals. Eric, you brought that up. Salman is his name, and he has a couple more meets coming up soon. And basically, he kind of had what was a much better performance than we anticipated. We were expecting some grinds on his lifts, but he blew up his squat, blew up his bench press, blew up his deadlift. And so now we're planning for a bigger meet at his next one, and a bigger meet thereafter. We're planning for small jumps meet to meet, but essentially planning for continuous progress between now and what we're expecting to be IPF Worlds next year in Minsk, where he's going to be part of the junior team. So I feel like I went on a huge tangent here, but such is life. And so anyway, the point being, kind of communicating the importance of taking meets in the year where either we just shouldn't compete, or where, we're not going to be able to set PRs. Just telling someone flat out, like, you're probably not going to PR at this meet. And maybe that sounds like I wouldn't call it bad coaching, but a coach being negative, but that's actually me trying to support the long-term goals of an athlete. And so we all kind of have to have those hard conversations sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to bridge off that and just say that, like, there are ways to approach competitions where you don't have to expect peak performance every time. Like, one strategy Eric and I have used off and on is to have a meet where you step on the platform for the practice of getting on the platform and feeling the meet nerves of hitting that first squat. And, just managing time doing warm-ups and, managing the meet environment. So you get practice doing that, but you're not taking maximal loads on the platform. So we've had meets in the past where we hit my first attempt as a third attempt, or we hit an RPE 9 to 9.5 on a third attempt, just as like a safe number, just to get 9 lifts in the bag, and, go home and just kind of treat it like a practice type session in a competition. And this is something that I think is used more across the pond over in Europe, just as the fact that there are more competitions throughout the year. So athletes maybe are doing this much more frequently. Do any of you guys know anything about that?
Well, I don't know if I could speak to what other people are doing, but I was going to talk about this. There's something to be said for training through a meet. So I know with a couple of my Canadian lifters, more of the juniors, the timeline is very short. So the requirements up there are a bit different. I don't know the details. One of you can fill that in later. But basically, with junior provincials, and then there's central, and then there's nationals, and they're all probably like 4 or 5 months apart. So I actually just recently, one of my athletes is planning to do centrals and nationals, and we're putting, obviously nationals is much more the priority of the lift. So basically training isn't going to change. The only thing that's going to differ is, rather than training 4 days of the week, they're going to take 2 days off. So they're going to skip day 3 and day 4, or how many ever days they train, and get back to training the week after. So it's like, as you said, there's something to be said for meet experience. Not every meet you need to PR. You don't need to go into competition and add to your total. You can add to the experience. You can add to your confidence. You can add to just what you've taken away from the competition. So I think it just comes down to prioritizing what that specific meet is for. Are we there to chase the best performance possible, or are we there to build meet experience?
Yeah, and I think defining the goal of the competition, just like Chris alluded to, is really important too. We kind of have this overarching goal always of improving our powerlifting total, but sometimes smaller goals too, like practice or improving one lift specifically, or just training through the competition too, and using it as practice to get rid of meat nerves and stuff like that.
There's definitely something to be said about using a meet to become not just a stronger lifter by numbers, but to become a better lifter. Just to kind of reword what you were saying there, Bryce, and there's a definite difference. You can identify many cases of lifters who are incredibly strong who just don't have it on meet day, and that can be for a number of different reasons. And I mean, I'll reference you when you were competing at 93, Bryce, and you didn't really like not have it per se, but meat nerves, I know for a fact, were a big issue for you for a long time, and essentially getting practice on the platform and getting more comfortable and having the help that you've had your last few meets from Matt Gary has turned all of your competitions into RPE 9.5 third attempts, and essentially, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, ultimately you're focusing on the win, which is really kind of what we pride ourselves upon, is going in and hitting the numbers we need to win. That's the goal. You can PR any day in the gym. Don't waste any of your 27 white lights on a lift that you're guessing about, and sure. All of those things are kind of factors of being a better power lifter from a competitive standpoint, and that's kind of the skill aspect of knowing what to do on meet day.
Yeah, I'm down with that. And it's always a work in progress. Like even at what I consider one of my best competitions, this Raw Nationals that just happened, like I derped hard and I missed a press command on my bench press. So it's always a work in progress. And a question for later would be our favorite worst experiences or favorite noob mistakes from our early powerlifting meets ourselves, just because that's always fun to talk about. But
it absolutely is.
Sticking with periodization, because I really want to talk about this, and one of the triggers for me thinking about this topic for today was an article that I got to see from the Olympic Coach magazine. This one was on long-term athletic development for multi-year sports, specifically for Olympic sports. But some of the ideas still apply to powerlifting. So this is kind of going over the model of how you expect an athlete to progress from their very first time being introduced to athletics up to elite levels of performance. And so there's a level of play, and then there's a level of fundamentals, and then there's a level of training to train, and then training to compete, and then training to win as athletes go on. How do you envision that stuff meshing with powerlifting? Essentially what I'm trying to ask is, if you had someone that was brand new to powerlifting, how would you train them for the first 2 years? How would you train them for the next 2 years? And how would you train them as time goes on? Like, does their percentage of time spent training doing just competition squatting go up? Are they doing more movement variation, like to the extreme as they're younger athletes? Or is it just a matter of increasing training volume and frequency over time?
That's kind of an interesting question, actually, that brings up a conversation that I remember I was participating in a while back when it was training a juggernaut or something, and I was over really probably more eavesdropping than anything between Chad and I think Max Ada, and they were discussing kind of the more Eastern Bloc style of Olympic weightlifting training specifically, where a large portion of the early careers of the athletes is focused on generalized athletic development, instead of they don't throw them straight under a high bar squat and don't have them jump right into trying to do clean and jerks and snatches. They spend a large portion of their early careers, when we're talking several years here, building up an athletic base, getting good at running, getting good at jumping, getting good at swimming, and essentially focusing on overall development. And I mean, anecdotally speaking here, this is something that I've observed, and I know we've all observed. People who are athletes, like actual athletes, so basketball, football players, all those people tend to be better lifters for a few different reasons. And one of the biggest ones that I've observed is they tend to be more resilient to injury. And you'll watch some of the lifts that like a Division I athlete is doing, and you're like, oh my God, that technique is horrible. But they're able to withstand that. It's this kind of causation correlation thing where it's not necessarily the case that it is, but it seems to be that more people who are more athletic do that. So I think in the early portions of someone, if they had just started training, like entirely just started training, and on day one, they're like, I want to be a powerlifter. I think that a big focus in their early training should be general athletic development. You should have them out running sprints, doing different kinds of jumps, kind of focusing on not just the barbell movements. And I would kind of make that a minimal, that's a case where I might even have someone start with training like with lower frequency, just because overall I would want them to be more athletic as opposed to jumping right into what might end up being kind of handicapping themselves for long-term progress if they were to get right under a barbell.
Yeah, that's a super tough pill to swallow for a lot of people, I think, to want to train for powerlifting specifically, but then to look at a training program and realize that very little of your training is squatting, benching, and deadlifting. And you know, speaking to the point of general development, I think most of our training programs have some degree of generalized hypertrophy work in them. Athletes aren't specifically doing squatting, benching, and deadlifting, even, you know, highly experienced athletes, because it's that important, and because for our unidimensional sports, global increases in hypertrophy really do potentiate strength. But yeah, I was curious how a powerlifter would train, you know, as someone who is way early on compared to someone who's way later on. I personally think you might be able to get away with extremely lower intensities. Like, take the training approach that you might give to an intermediate athlete and then subtract 10% for most of the training intensities. Like, it might not feel like athletes are getting training effect, but they're probably getting a lot of practice on the main movement and just kind of figuring out how to move their body through space. Eric, I was curious about your thoughts about some of this stuff, because you've dealt with a pretty wide range of athletes, from older athletes, elite athletes, world-class athletes, and then some super beginners too. And I was wondering how you've approached this in some real-world scenarios.
So I think it's pretty rare for somebody to take their first steps into a gym and say, oh, I want to be a competitive powerlifter and take the sport as far as I can. That's not something you're going to commonly see. So a lot of the people that come to us, at least a lot of the more beginner lifters, at least have maybe a couple of years of experience just being in the gym in general. But even still, I think a lot of those people would be well served to spend more time just focusing on general athletic development, hypertrophy, and just building a base that they can build from later on when they want to be more focused on more specific powerlifting training.
What does that mean when you say build a base? Because I hear this thrown around just like an absolute ton in terms of the strength training community, like base building, or here's a base building block, or so on. Like, what does that mean?
So it can mean a few different things, but I'm speaking to a base in terms of their overall work capacity as well as their muscular development as well.
Sweet. So one of the things I want to do over the course of these podcasts is, you know, break down some of the myths and some of the things that people hear, so that there might be a little bit more clarity when they go about some of this stuff. And, you know, of course, in terms of periodization, there's a ton more to talk about. We can talk about, you know, what accumulation is, what intensification, or some of the different terminology in how to structure periodization, like, you know, even as basic as linear periodization or some other things we've done. And then we can get into some more complex stuff. But I wanted to speak to another point in this article just about specializing early, and about that leading to high rates of injury and high rates of burnout in athletes.
So I was going to touch on a little bit about the specific movements and how there's some individual variability as far as durability for athletes with the competition lifts.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're looking at, let's say, a low bar squat, for most, I would say maybe 80 to 90% of people, a low bar squat is going to be their strongest squat variation for powerlifting. There's certainly a few people that are stronger high bar, but that being said, low bar for a lot of people can also cause some issues if they train it very frequently and at high volume. So a lot of times we'll see shoulder pain, elbow pain, and a lot of that stems from bicep tendonitis. So that's one of the reasons that we have to include a little bit of exercise variety to accommodate for that. So some people might only be able to handle 3 to 4 weeks of consistent low bar squatting before they start to get some of those symptoms that affect both their squat and their bench, and just kind of starts a downward trend in their training. So it's important for us to have those modifications ready for the athletes that aren't quite as durable with the competition lifts.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember doing some low bar squatting for a while and it just lit up my rear delts and biceps, and I just couldn't take it for a whole lot of time. So, I mean, this is one reason why being a coach is fun, because you get to modify training to make sure that the athlete is suiting their needs. Even if on the face of it, it didn't seem like an obvious substitution to make. Like, look, I'm competition squatting in 2 weeks. Why am I doing high bar like for most of my squatting training? It's because you would wreck yourself. You'd bury yourself on the ground otherwise.
For sure. And then on the other hand, there's people that can basically stay competition specific year round. We might not necessarily want them to, but they have the durability to do it.
Do you see that transition happening over time? Like, one thing I think is at least an idea that a lot of people take to be characteristic of the way powerlifting training goes is that early on you'll have a lot of movement variation, and eventually you'll get to a point where you're doing just the competition lifts and maybe a little bit of extra hypertrophy as you're a world-class lifter. Like, do you think that's realistic?
I think that's pretty common. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I think Hani had something to add in.
Yeah, well, I had something for the last one, but actually I can talk on this one too. So by no means am I a world-class athlete, but I've been training for long enough to consider myself what I think would be advanced. And I mean, ultimately, I don't think everyone's timeline ends up with 700-pound squats and 800-pound deadlifts. So talking specifically on ending up on very specific training, I had a vast amount of experience with just squats and just bench and just deadlifts over the course of within the last like 18 to 24 months. And I can say specifically for me, while I could feel that it was effective, there were points where I felt like essentially, you could put any weight on that bar and I wasn't going to not lift it, within reason, of course. But it kind of identified weaknesses that existed in me, possibly because of my lack of general athleticism when I started powerlifting. But things like a lagging core that eventually led to bad positioning and lack of hip mobility, and those two things combined leading to a pretty severe lower back issue. I may have never identified those issues had I not spent time training that way, or they may never have become an issue that was debilitating and kept me in bed. And so I think that ending up at all specific training is something that people can do, but I agree with Eric in saying that it's not necessarily the be all and end all of ideal training approaches for advanced or high level athletes. There are plenty of people you can think of who do a lot of variation. Someone like Mike Tuchscherer comes to mind. I know he plays around with a lot of different variations on his lifts, and I mean he's an absolute world class athlete, one of the greatest deadlifters of all time. And although I don't know that he does a lot of variations with his deadlift, so I don't know if there's a connection between those two. But in any case, I think I got the point across that I wanted to say.
I wanted to kind of bridge off that and just talk about the fact that increases in exercise specificity isn't the only way to go among high-level coaches. Like, I know Boris Shaiko, with a lot of his high-level athletes, actually has them do increased movement variation, the idea being that he's choosing movements that attack a very specific weakness that an athlete has, and he views that as the main way that athletes are getting stronger at that level. Like, how do you go from an 850 deadlift to an 875 deadlift, or whatever the numbers are for these extreme high-level athletes, besides finding a specific weakness and attacking it? So they might do like block pulls with bands from a very exact height, like 20 centimeters or something like that, and that's the way they attack a specific weakness. Now, I'm not sure I agree with that, but it's a strategy that exists, and lots of athletes get strong, and there are lots of different ways to get athletes strong.
Absolutely. And I mean, I don't disagree with the idea that, or I do kind of disagree with a lot of ideas when it comes to using accommodating resistance and things like that. I just find that in practice, they tend to not be any more effective than what you can do with just a barbell. But with regards to like getting someone from 850 to 875, it may just be a case of keeping them away from injury, and keeping them training. And a lot of people really underrate the importance of that.
For sure.
Hanny, that's I think that's one of the reasons why Shaiko uses those variations. If I recall correctly, with some of the stuff that I've read from him, he uses variations like that to mask overall intensity. So it might
exactly.
it might be a lower absolute weight on the barbell, but it might mimic something that ends up being a higher intensity that way.
Right.
Yeah.
He likes to sneak in that as a way of having some higher intensity exposure without the same recovery consequences. So it might be something like an 80% deadlift with a certain amount of weight in chains that makes it 90%. So he feels like that's a way of exposing them to that 90% weight range without having the same recovery requirements for that.
Which for a more advanced athlete might be a good thing because their recovery might not be what it used to be.
Yeah, that might be the case. Before we kind of switch topics and go to a Q&A as we finish up this one, I wanted to ask if you thought increased movement variation led to increased rates of injury, like doing a novel movement and not knowing exactly how to do it versus doing, the squat pattern that you are able to do so much. Like this might not be something we have really good data on, but I'd be interested to see if athletes get more injured doing the weird movement variation they don't normally do in their training, or the squat they've been doing, or if it's really weight specific, or if there's some other parameter addressing that.
I think for the most part, when we introduce a new movement, it's going to be something where it's pretty low intensity, low RPEs or low percentages. So it gives them room to kind of adapt to the movement and build some momentum with it without jumping right into something overly challenging that might compromise themselves.
Gotcha. So I popped the little picture of us over on the Instagrams, and I've got a few questions for us in a general Q&A. And I think it might be nice to finish off our podcasts with these and kind of take a few. So not discriminating as far as questions goes. I'm just going to take a few in order here. Turn Down for Squat says, naming no names, what's the funniest and or worst client experience you've had? And I'll stick with funniest just because I think that's a lot more interesting. So funniest client experience you guys have had.
Bryce, you go first.
Chris,
go first.
I have one that comes to mind, and I still feel bad about this. So the way our spreadsheet is working, we have some collapsible kind of menus and spread on our spreadsheet, and I had not realized that when I collapsed the files or the column, that there was actually sets and reps to do underneath what I had prescribed. So, for example, I think I had like 3x3 at 78%, for example. And then below that, there was like 4x6 and 2x2. And so basically 4 weeks later, Casey's complaining about all this volume that she's been doing. And I'll take a look at it. She sends me a screenshot. So the way the iPhone works is that it doesn't recognize those collapsible menus. So lo and behold, she had done I think it was 3.5 times the amount of volume that I had intended.
Ooh. Ouch.
Yeah. I think a few of our gaffes are actually with typos and like technology type issues.
I have two that immediately come to mind. Number one is something that another coach and a good friend of ours, actually, Joe Stanek's coach, Elish, I worked with him for a long time, and back when he wasn't a completely broken and worthless human, I had written a program for him that had him, I think it was conventional deadlifting at the time, and a lot of the ways I build my programs, at least with regards to the percentage-based work, is just linear increments. So, adding 10 pounds a week, adding 5 pounds a week, if you're a 700-pound deadlifter, adding 15 pounds a week, whatever. And so we, and sometimes that kind of sneaks up on you with the amount of intensity you work your way up to. You just don't realize. And that could be very positive with something like, let's say, a female squatter, for example, who squatted 225, and right now she's doing sets of 6 with 220. I think her max is probably increased. And it's a really easy way to kind of sneak that in without being intimidating and throwing that right onto the spreadsheet. Mm-hmm. But for Elish, what it ended up being was, this was back when I was a little bit of a crueler coach. I think I had him doing 6 sets of 8 on deadlifts, and we worked up to 80% of his max. It was either 6 sets of 8 or 8 sets of 6.
8 sets of 6.
8 sets of 6. Yeah, of course, Eric, you know that because he's probably told this story to you. And yeah, he ended up messaging me like one set left, and he's all, "Did you mean to do this?" And my first response is, "Why wouldn't you ask me this before starting training?" And he ended up finishing the last set and then just laying down and essentially like passing out from like total body shutdown. He just had nothing left. And so this is a story he loves to tell, and I actually is really funny in retrospect and very applicable to this right now. And I mean, accidents happen. We're humans, right? But it was that was a funny one, and I mean, in my mind, I'd have looked at that if that was my coach writing that for me, and I appreciate the trust he had in me, but I would have kind of emailed back and been like, "Did you mean for that?" And so now you know, Elish, next time ask. But second example, another client of mine, Canadian guy, Canadian? No, actually, Scandinavian, different client. He similar to what Chris had happen with Casey, but the inverse. So I had multiple sets programmed in different different rows of the spreadsheet. So it was like one single at RPE 8, followed by some sets of 6 at whatever percentage, followed by some other sets at whatever percentage. And when he opened the spreadsheet on his phone, all of the columns or all of the rows were collapsed. And so for what amounted to an entire block, I thought he wasn't filling out a spreadsheet. Turns out he was just doing one single at a relatively conservative intensity on the same lift multiple days per week. And so it was like a bench press single at 90%, 2 days a week was all of his bench press work, and he was missing out on like 12 other sets. And so it ended up getting to the end of the block. And I was like, "Arno, why aren't you filling out your spreadsheet?" He's like, "What are you talking about?" And I was like the other sets, and it was a big, oh. And so that was just a really, really fun in that experience.
That's awesome. Any of you guys have other stories you want to share?
So I don't want to turn this into a powercast or anything, but I've had several athletes report to me with sharding incidents while squatting.
Dang it, Eric, you stole my story.
I won't name any names, but they know who they are.
Yeah.
So I've got an interesting story at Ohio State's. One of my athletes, I'm not going to name him just because I don't want to. Only he and I know that this happened. But on his second deadlift, he actually, a little bit of poop came out, and because of that, he ran to the bathroom immediately after. He was in a flight of like 8 lifters. Came back after cleaning himself up. He was probably like 2 out. And we looked down, and he completely forgot his belt. So he had to run back, like full sprint, grab the belt, sprint out onto the platform, and go for his third deadlift. Probably with still a little bit of poop left in his pants too. Not the best situation.
Mark Bell, I'm sorry.
I don't think you have to apologize. I think he'd laugh.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Next question. Apart from your athletes making progress / hitting PRs, what's been the most satisfying feeling as a coach? Lifting Jack sent that one in. I kind of want to take that just because for me, one of the most satisfying things is when someone I don't know, they're just grateful that they've gotten to a specific point. And it's not necessarily just progress. It's just that they're able to look back and kind of see that they've now enjoyed the journey. So like I have an athlete that we did a lot of just kind of like life appreciation kind of work and change of attitude towards life. And, I'm not a psychologist and I don't pretend to be, but it was just very helpful and just super rewarding for me to hear from him that I've helped him as much off the platform and away from powerlifting training as I did with powerlifting training. So that's mine.
I think my favorite is when you can get that real life kind of life balance between training and enjoying the kind of other things that life has to offer. I remember this was when I was living in DC. I was biking a lot, and one of my athletes is like, "Aren't you scared that you're going to get weaker or that's going to impact your recovery?" I was like, "I'll take it one piece at a time, but I'm not going to modify what I actually enjoy doing outside of training just because of the small possible side effect that it might impact my training." And so I think helping some people kind of not necessarily lower the priority, but understand that there's a lot more to be said than just powerlifting.
Yeah.
I think the good quote is, if the only thing you have to talk about is powerlifting, or if the only thing you're focused on is powerlifting, you're a boring person, or something along those lines. I don't know the quote exactly. But it's just, I mean, there's more to life than just powerlifting. And helping some of the athletes and trying to understand that is really probably my favorite part.
Yeah, I think it goes deeper than that too. Just like, not being scared to live life or being unidimensional is something that you're speaking to. I'm not saying that I haven't skipped out on a few snowboarding trips because I was worried about how it was going to affect my powerlifting training, or like, God forbid, like we talk about bodybuilding and how hellish most of our diets have been for a while there, and how inflexible we thought they were, or we convinced ourselves they were. But yeah, I mean, something that we all really speak to and we all really strive to provide for our athletes is an acceptance that there needs to be balance. And we even push for that sometimes. Like I've pushed my athletes to get out of their house or to go experience or to go, find friends or make friends or try new activities and stuff like that. And, I still count that stuff as extremely important.
Yeah.
I have a moment that I can bring up here from nationals.
Yeah.
And this is kind of lift specific related, but not quite. I won't say who the athlete was, but he had just a killer meet. Ended up going 8 for 9, only missing one lift. It was a huge squat PR, and it was for depth, which was disappointing, but it is what it is. And so after the meet, he was talking to me, and he's like, "Man, I really feel great. I've never felt so physically not beat up after a meet," which was awesome because it was 3 PRs and big total PR. And he's like, "It's just my body feels good. I feel like I could compete again tomorrow." And so he had one of his friends there with him that was filming his lifts, and it was probably an hour later. I was walking around in the back because I ended up walking around what amounted to like probably 1,000 laps around the Raw Nationals building of what I was doing, walking around. And he walked up to me, his friend did, and he kind of had like kind of welled up eyes, and he's like, I just want you to know what you did for Eric was so special. Oops, said his name. What you did for him was so special. The fact that he came out of this meet in no pain and his whole prep was so comfortable, and the fact that he didn't really have to suffer the way that he normally does, he's like, it's really special to us, man, and we all really appreciate it. And it was just to feel such intense gratitude for something that you don't even really necessarily think about typically. People don't so often think about the week after the meet and what athletes feel like. And so to have someone come and to show gratitude to me for having their friend not be so beat up after finishing a meet was really an awesome and different feeling, something that I hadn't really been thanked for before, and it was special to me.
I feel special for hearing that.
Yeah, awesome. I really value the connections we're able to make with our athletes, and I think we try to keep it so that the training is something that enhances their life. So we always are excited to see when they have accomplishments outside of the gym, things like graduating or getting into law school or a promotion or things like that. We can always kind of celebrate with them. And then personally at Raw Nationals, I had a group of my lifters who all came together and made shirts for me and did a big thank you, and that really meant a lot to me. So it shows that they appreciate it, and I really appreciate them. So that was awesome.
Yeah, that was really special to be there, and like I was blown away that they all got Team Bodhorny shirts with your face like blown up big on the front of it. For those of you guys that weren't there, like it was just super cheesy, and Eric isn't a guy to show a lot of emotion, and I think we almost got him to show emotion.
It was close.
We were close. Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
My favorite story is probably the first time that I got to handle athletes as the TSA intern. So I got to handle 2 athletes, Kyla Cantias and Hani Jazayrli, and the 2 of them were just throughout the whole day. They were so awesome to handle. They were super receptive of me, despite it being, the first time I had even met them, let alone handle them in powerlifting. And they were just so thankful, and the amount of gratitude that I had gotten, I think it was just something new that I had never really experienced before. And that's one of the reasons why game day coaching has become probably my favorite part of the job, is just because I get to see the joy of the lifters, hitting the lifts that they want. And then afterward, they were kind enough to buy me dinner. And I always just think back to how awesome that was. And it only just seems to get better every time that I do it.
Joe, you kind of reminded me as we wrap up this, and I think we'll take one or two more questions here, just like some fun ones at the end. But if you guys are only involved in the sport as an athlete, I think it would be very rewarding for you guys to get involved in the sport, both as a handler to other athletes and also as a referee at a competition. It will let you know more about the sport. You get to learn more about it. You get to see different sides of powerlifting. You get to have an appreciation for how powerlifting meets are run. You get to understand more about attempt selection and, game day coaching. So I highly encourage you guys to get involved with the sport at that level. Two more questions. Who has the biggest triceps in the CPU?
Ooh.
Definitely not Joanna. Absolutely. Absolutely not Joanna.
Man, it's Kelly Brenton for sure.
Oh, yeah.
You seen his bench lately?
Yeah, what up, Kelly? And finally, Eric, in one sentence, Aydin H. wants to know all about programming.
In one second.
Wow. Email me.
That's actually a completely valid response. I'm impressed.
that is a full sentence. It's a short sentence, but it's a full one. All right, guys. It's been an hour. That is episode 2 here. How often are we going to try to do these, guys?
I think every other week is going to be our goal. So as Bryce brought up on Instagram, I made a post as well on the YouTube videos. Anywhere that you can find us on social media, shoot us a DM, shoot us a message on Facebook. If you have an interesting topic, something you want to hear about, let us know. And by all means, if we don't have a big objection to it for whatever reason, we can certainly bring it up in one of our podcasts and kind of get our opinion out there about it. By all means, we want to keep these fun as well as interesting and informative, and we would love to kind of talk about what you guys want to hear. So please don't hesitate, and we'll be happy to. And also, if you can think of reasonable guests to get a hold of, or if you're listening to this and you feel like you would be a good addition to our podcast, shoot us an email and let us know.
Yes, absolutely. In the future, we want to have some special guests on here. Just a few last plugs as far as stuff. You can find us all on Instagram at our first names, except for Chris, which is his last name, Aydin, Aydin, _ TSA for all of us. You can find us on Facebook. And please go to our website, thestrengthathlete.com. There are 2 things of interest there. There's a resources section with just a bunch of links to some good information about programming and some of the varied things that we're talking about, and also a freebies section with, among other things, a fantastic generalized 9-week intermediate training program that would be a great place to start or modify
Bryce,
training from.
I might add that there is a third interesting thing. There is some very premium coaching offered on that website as well.
That's great.
But yeah, check us out, guys, online. There's a lot of great information about who we are, what we do, what we stand for. And if we aren't the people who can help you, we'll help you find the people who can.
Sweet. This is all of the Strength Athlete signing off. See you guys next time.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.